Okay, so I checked the previous podcast, which was, disrupted in the middle for technical reasons. There's a little bit of a scratch when I transition from the previous piece to the new piece I added, but it's not bad at all. Okay, so let's continue with the executive summary here of the Adaptation Gap Report 2023 from UNEP. Progress in adaptation implementation is progress in adaptation implementation in developing countries is plateauing. So they will not be able to keep up if we don't do something about this. What does it mean? The number of adaptation actions supported through 4 international climate funds, which I cut off here, but basically it's all the Green Fund, the Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund, and the Multi-Bank Fund, and so on, that you can look up. So this I add some commentary, then I lose the thought, right? The number of adaptation actions supported through 4 international climate funds was lower in 2022 than in the previous year, but their value has been rising due to investments in very large projects, as we'll see in a minute. This probably does not reflect a trend, but rather points to fluctuations driven by non-climated events such as COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine. While there is a significant variability in both value and number of new projects, the financial value continues to grow, whereas the number of new projects appears to have stagnated for the past decade. This means that the gap between implementing adaptation actions and accelerating climate risks is widening. We have to keep in mind that the big projects that we are talking about here with big funding may also mean that locking into hard structures that may reduce the ability to navigate between the adaptation maladaptation continuum that we discussed. So we want the adaptation projects to be flexible and respond to evolving climate risks and be able to adjust them, but that's not always going to be possible anyways. So hopefully the best you can do is avoid maladaptation. Considering that the AGRs, so this is the report, Adaptation Gap Reports, first detailed analysis of adaptation communications shows that a majority of actions implemented by developing countries depend on external financial support. Failure to reinvigorate investments in adaptation action will inevitably lead to more unabated climate impacts and subsequent loss and damage. This will make debt-ridden developing countries even more vulnerable to climate-related extreme events and slow onset changes, so the chronic and acute stresses from climate, and is particularly true for least developed countries and small island developing states. We discussed this elsewhere. So slowly shifting changes like increasing temperatures, decreasing rainfall, or increasing extreme rainfall can end up causing problems that you are not anticipating well or developing adaptation planning very well, and so on. Okay, so the number of new adaptation projects funded through the UNFCCC climate funds we're looking at total values and total value of the projects with a 5-year running average. So number of projects hasn't increased monotonically, but if you look at the total value of the projects, they have increased. So value of the projects has increased. Is that good news or bad news? As we said, this could be because COVID-19 came and the adaptation projects were used as incentives to kick back the economy or create employment, or were forced because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and so on. Okay, so we have to be careful. So these are basically number of projects here and trillions of US dollars on this side here. Okay, keep again in mind that we are still inadequate in terms of funding. So the scales here, green to dark blue, go from 0.5 to 10 million to greater than 50 million. Okay, estimated adaptation costs and needs for developing countries are significantly higher than previous estimates, with a plausible central range of US $215 billion to 387 billion per year this decade. Okay, so I won't read all the text here, but the estimated new range of 215 billion to 387 billion per year dollars is significantly higher than earlier adaptation gap report estimates and is equivalent to between 0.6% and 1% of all developing countries' GDPs combined. So each country benefits by thinking of investments in adaptation as a fraction of the GDP because the actual numbers may look scary. So if GDP goes down, you reduce the amount. If GDP goes up, you increase the amount, so that mainstreaming of the adaptation into the fiscal policies and setting aside the funds to build resilience in addition to dealing with crisis on a daily timescale must continue in a sustainable fashion. Okay, so let's move on. Despite the urgent need to accelerate and scale up international public adaptation finance to developing countries, these flows have actually declined since 2020. Okay, so this I'll read because this is an important message. International public climate finance flows to developing countries decreased by 15% to US $21.3 billion in 2021 after having increased to $25.2 billion between 2018 and 2020. In contrast, mitigation finance continuously increased over the same period, setting an important precedent. Meanwhile, international public adaptation finance over the past 5 years has also suffered from a low disbursement ratio at 66% as compared to the overall development finance disbursement ratio of 98%, what is planned and what is actually released. This indicates that there are barriers specific to adaptation such as low grant to loan ratios and lack of knowledge about adaptation policies. To ensure adaptation finance flows from developed to developing countries To ensure adaptation finance flows from developed to developing countries double to reach US 40 billion by 2025, US dollar 40 billion, as pledged at COP26 in Glasgow, finance providers must on average increase annual adaptation flows by at least 16% between 2022 and 2025. So Israel and Hamas war is still going on, Russian war is still going on, Middle East is still very unsettled, Syria is not resolved, and so on. So what are the chances that this kind of increase will come? We don't know. Adaptation finance gap is likely 10 to 18 times as great as current international adaptation finance flows, at least 50% higher than previous range estimates. So obviously any estimate is going to have uncertainties, but other factors of just not having the finance flows and using massive discount rates or simply discounting the project's adaptation plans submitted, especially by the global south, can become a serious issue in handicapping them for preparing these. Okay, so again, achieving the goal of doubling adaptation finance by 2025 would only reduce the gap by between 5% and 10%. So it's already quite high, and the estimate has been updated by 50% than the previous estimate. And even if we meet the goals of increasing the rate of increase that we want here at 16%, up to 2020, out to 2025, the gap would still be only reduced by 5 to 10%. Okay. Comparison of adaptation finance needs, modeled costs, and international public adaptation finance flows in developing countries. Again, remember these are models, so there are uncertainties which can be used to play the game in either way of increasing funding or decreasing funding. So here we are looking at US $1 billion per year for developing countries, going from up to 400 billion or half a trillion. So adaptation financing needs $387 billion per year out to 2030. Each year you need that much. That's the finance need. Modeled costs of adaptation at $250 billion per year this decade itself. And if you look at finance flows where we are, international public finance at US $21 billion in 2021, and doubling adaptation finance from 2019 levels would bring us to here at 42. But if we want to meet the adaptation goals, we need to get up to here. If we want to meet the upper end, the adaptation finance gap has to be closed by reaching out to here. So adaptation costs for or slash finance needs are 10 to 18 times as much as current flows of finance. The gap is estimated at $194 billion to $366 billion per year based on 2021 adaptation flows here. Okay, some sobering numbers. Nonetheless, greater international public adaptation finance could still effectively reduce climate risks and deliver high benefits. For instance, studies indicate that $16 billion invested in agriculture per year would prevent about 78 million people from starving or chronic hunger because of climate change impacts. Similarly, every $1 billion invested in adaptation against coastal flooding leads to a $14 billion reduction in economic damages. So this is the best way to think about it. Investing in adaptation, the benefits accrue over time, and net, cost-benefit analysis has to worry about how to count for benefits, especially in terms of investing in managing crisis after crisis versus building resilience to reduce the damages. Therefore, more must be done to bridge the adaptation finance gap. However, due to budgetary constraints, countries are often inactive, adapt reactively, and or rely on international support, and causing overall costs to rise, limiting effectiveness and leading to maladaptation. Gender equality and social inclusion are inadequately included in adaptation finance needs and flows. So even if, as we are looking at these gaps and the need to increase funding, we are still missing gender equality and social inclusion. Okay. I'll read just for the sake of completion, because this is the executive summary. We should plow through it and then just look at key figures. There is global recognition that climate change can exacerbate inequality in multiple dimensions of social identity, including gender, indigeneity, age, ethnicity, migrant status, or disability. At the same time, adaptation activities considering gender and other social identities are linked with higher effectiveness in achieving their objectives. We talked about this before, about how including women in decisions, even on disaster management, can increase their effectiveness and cost effectiveness as well, right? So just to read another, these findings highlight the need for greater transparency and consistency in the reporting of gender equality markers, and that climate finance providers must increase adaptation funding that is responsive to gender and social inclusion in order to support more equitable and effective adaptation. This shouldn't just become a compliance requirement. These inclusion and inclusivity, inclusiveness, and gender equity, etc., should not just be compliance requirements, afterthoughts, and so on. They should become part of the social norms based on which we keep doing these adaptation interventions. Essentially, these are interventions. People are asked and required and forced to change lives and livelihoods, so we must pay attention to the impacts in terms of equity and justice. Bridging the adaptation finance gap requires more international, domestic, and private finance, ideally a reform of the global financial architecture and better international cooperation. Well, let's hope this happens. Domestic expenditure and private finance are potentially important sources of adaptation finance, but quantitative estimates are not yet available because their flows remain difficult to track. Nonetheless, domestic budgets are likely to be a large source of funding for adaptation in many developing countries, ranging from 0.2% to over 5% of the government budgets. Not GDPs, but budgets. So having national adaptation plan and mainstreaming adaptation into fiscal policies ensures that these kind of requirements are met in the government budgets themselves. But jumping to the end, however, neither domestic expenditures nor private finance flows are likely to bridge the adaptation finance gap alone, especially in low-income countries, including least developed countries and small island developing states. small island and developing states, and there are important equity issues related to using these flows to fill the gap in these countries. Okay, so let's plow through and finish again. This report identifies 7 ways to bridge the adaptation financing gap, which we will look at in a figure. So maybe I should just jump to the figure here. This is, sorry, that's ES5, yes. 7 ways to bridge the adaptation finance gap. Let's start here. International public adaptation finance, private sector finance, domestic expenditure on adaptation, and 4 is increase in financing for small and medium enterprises. Remittances, so even after planning, actual disbursement has to happen, and other kinds of remittances from international agencies. Greater international cooperation is required to unlock finance at scale, as we go out in this circle. The colors being core approaches here, 1, 2, 3, and additional approaches in these various green colors. So 6 is on reforming of the global financial architecture that we just mentioned. The last one, implementation of Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, which you have to go and look up, but here it is. Implementation of Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement on making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low carbon and climate resilient development. It is important to note that these 7 ways offer different opportunities and constraints across countries. For example, LDCs rely most heavily on international support, in particular grants, so not loans, and bridging the adaptation finance gap requires attention to both quantitative and qualitative aspects such as access to finance and equity. Equity, how to implement is not always clear. Slow and insufficient action on mitigation and adaptation is increasingly translating into soft and hard limits to adaptation, and some of which may have already been reached in terms of the limits. Lack of conceptual clarity is a clear barrier to making political and operational progress on loss and damage. So you can read up the COP28 on how it struggled with loss and damage. Loss and damage is increasingly mentioned in national adaptation plans and nationally determined contributions, but these documents say little about options to address loss and damage and largely miss the requirements in terms of NELD, which ELD and ELD are here, economic losses and damages, and non-economic losses and damages. So economic losses and damages and non-economic losses and damages. Okay, so could be biodiversity loss, ecosystem services loss, coastal erosions, and losses of mangroves, which are economic in the ultimate picture but not so in the immediate GDP type of calculations. Okay, given the complex, compounding, cascading, and transboundary nature of climate risk, coordination across global frameworks besides the UNFCCC, such as the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction and Sustainable Development Goals, will contribute towards strengthening loss and damage management approaches. There is also a need for more regional and subnational cooperation on loss and damage with transboundary characteristics to take advantage of opportunities of scale and to overcome barriers to implementation. Finally, all responses must respect country ownership and be equitable, inclusive, accessible, and adequate. So here is a figure showing how to avert and minimize addressing loss and damages. So we are going from averting loss and damage to minimizing loss and damage, addressing loss and damage, and the climate change events being extreme and slow onset events. So storms, typhoons, cyclones, extreme drought, rising sea levels, ocean acidification, glacial melt, heat waves, floods, wildfires, and Associated loss and damages include emergency response, rebuilding, addressing loss of damage requires these: emergency response, rebuilding funds, relocation support, livelihood programs, social protection, and so on. So mitigation to reduce emissions requires reducing risk and to avert loss and damage. Reducing risk here in terms of minimizing loss and damage with adaptation and disaster risk reduction to minimize loss and damage, and residual risks which are not going to go away, so you need to address these by transfer of risks such as insurance and social protection, retained risk such as contingency funds, so you have to deal with certain risks that will remain and we have to retain them. Many uncertainties remain regarding the financial needs for addressing loss and damage, but innovative funding sources and governance structure must be found to reach the necessary scale. Okay, so oops, I kind of when you hit this forward button too hard, it jumps out of the figure. So let's oops, I went all the way back unfortunately, so let me jump through these just so that you can get an idea of how far we came. So we said this already. Oops. Many uncertainties remain regarding financial needs for addressing loss and damage, but innovative funding sources and governance structures must be found to reach the necessary scale, which is something I already said, but I got confused and came back to it. Nonetheless, let's conclude the executive summary here. Very brief, but I hope useful. You can go back to the report and look at the details with all the detailed citations, which are very useful as well. Okay, see you in some more figures on the adaptation gap report from the rest of the chapters. Okay.